Don't provoke me again, or I won't be a gentleman. Victor Moretti let the warning hang for a beat, then added in a lower, colder voice. Take a good look at where you are, and remember your place. Nina Carter stopped in the middle of the hallway, a glass of water in her hand, her face, her bare shoulders, the thin straps of her nightshirt, the light cotton falling to just above her knees. Nina kept her posture straight. I came for water. Victor started walking toward her, not quickly, not carelessly. Every step was measured, controlled, as if the air itself made room for him. He stopped in front of her, close enough to make the hallway feel smaller. You should know better than to walk around this house like that. Nina looked down at herself once, then back up. Like what? Don't do that. Do what? Pretend you don't understand what I mean. Nina's grip tightened slightly around the glass. It's a nightshirt. In your room, he said. Not in my hallway. Nina should have apologized. Should have lowered her eyes and let the moment end. That was probably what most employees did around Victor Moretti. She did not. I didn't expect anyone to be awake. Victor's jaw shifted. That doesn't make it acceptable. He lifted one hand and braced it on the wall beside her head, trapping her in place without actually touching her. The movement was smooth, controlled, and far too deliberate to misunderstand. Nina's heartbeat picked up, but her voice stayed level. You're making this sound far more dramatic than it is. Am I? Yes. Victor studied her in silence for a second. This house is full of men who work for me. Security, drivers, staff. Men who know how to follow orders because I make sure they do. And you are walking through the middle of them in that. Nina's mouth tightened. There's no one here but you. That's not the point. Then what is? His eyes darkened. The point is that you seem very comfortable forgetting where you are. She held his gaze. I haven't forgotten anything. Victor laughed once, but there was no humor in it. No? No. For a moment neither of them moved. Then his voice dropped. Or is that exactly what you're doing? Nina frowned. What do you mean? Victor leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. Are you trying to seduce me? Then Nina gave a small, incredulous laugh. You're my employer, she said. I'm the maid. I don't and have never thought that way. Victor's face did not change, but something in his eyes did. Not softer. More complicated. No. Her tone stayed calm, clear. I came down for a glass of water, not to play games with you. He looked at the glass in her hand, still untouched, then back at her face. You expect me to believe that you walked out here dressed like this without knowing exactly what effect it might have? Nina tilted her head slightly. On who? Don't test me. I'm asking a simple question. His expression hardened. On any man who saw you. Nina exhaled through her nose. Then perhaps the problem isn't my nightshirt. Victor's gaze sharpened instantly. That's a dangerous answer. It's an honest one. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to be angry or impressed. Maybe both. You have no idea what kind of house this is. No, Nina said. I probably don't. But I do know one thing. His brow shifted slightly. What? You're not angry because I broke a rule. Her voice lowered, steady and precise. You're angry because you noticed me. The words landed cleanly. Victor's hand flexed once against the wall. His eyes held hers with a force that made her pulse hit harder. You think too highly of yourself. Nina almost smiled. No, I think very clearly. That answer brought him half an inch closer. Careful. You asked me a direct question, she said. I gave you a direct answer. Victor's voice became dangerously quiet. Then let me be direct too. Nina said nothing. You are here for my brother. You are here to work. You are not here to blur lines, test limits, or make me question decisions I already made. Finally, he reached up and touched her 2 fingers under her chin, lifting her face slightly. The contact was brief, controlled, and somehow more dangerous than if he had grabbed her. You are off limits, he said. Nina's breath slowed, not out of calm but focus. Then perhaps you should act like it. His thumb brushed once along the edge of her jaw. A mistake, or a confession. That, he said quietly, sounds very close to a challenge. Nina's voice stayed soft. No, it sounds like a reminder. Of what? Of the same thing you just told me. She held his gaze. You're the boss. I work here. That's all. Victor stared at her as if the answer irritated him more than anything else she could have said. If you provoke me like this again, he said, his voice dropping back into that dangerous calm, I won't be a gentleman. Nina did not look away. I'm not provoking you. That's exactly the problem. He leaned just close enough for his words to brush against her skin. You don't have to do anything. You just stand there, look at me like that. And suddenly every rule in this house feels thinner than it should. If this moment pulled you in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next chapter of this unforgettable story. Her pulse thudded once, hard, but she kept her expression composed. Then maybe this conversation should end. Victor held her eyes a moment longer. Then he stepped back. Go back to your room, he said. Nina nodded once. No argument, no apology. When she reached her room, she closed the door softly behind her and set the glass of water on the table beside the bed. She looked at herself in the mirror. This is not simple, she murmured. Nina barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victor in that hallway, his hand against the wall, his voice low and controlled, the warning in his eyes far more dangerous than the words themselves. By dawn, the untouched glass of water was still sitting on the bedside table, and the silence in her room felt less like peace than consequence. She rose before sunrise, showered, dressed carefully, and pinned her hair back with more precision than usual. A plain cream blouse, a dark skirt, nothing soft, nothing careless, nothing that could be misunderstood. By the time she stepped into the kitchen, the estate had already come alive in the quiet, efficient way large houses did. Coffee brewed somewhere near the back counter. A cook moved with practiced speed over a skillet. Silver trays caught the morning light. No one wasted motion. No one raised a voice. It was the kind of order that only existed when fear and discipline had lived in the same house for a very long time. Mrs. Harris stood near the center island with a clipboard in one hand and reading glasses low on her nose. She looked up the moment Nina entered. You're early, she said. I didn't sleep much. Mrs. Harris studied her for half a second, as if she understood more than Nina would have liked. That tends to happen your first week here. Nina accepted the coffee handed to her by one of the kitchen staff. Does it? In houses like this, Mrs. Harris said, people learn quickly or they leave quickly. The answer was calm, almost casual. That made it land harder. Nina took a sip. Strong coffee, no sugar, exactly what she needed. Will Daniel be down soon? She asked. In 30 minutes, if he cooperates. In 45, if he doesn't. Nina nodded. It was the first practical thing anyone had said all morning, and she was grateful for it. Mrs. Harris closed the clipboard. He's brighter than he lets on. Sensitive, too. Don't push him too hard. I won't. I know. The older woman paused. That's why you're here. The sentence settled in Nina's chest more heavily than it should have, because the truth was, she still wasn't entirely sure how she had ended up here. 3 months earlier, Nina Carter had been living in a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat in Queens, with a radiator that knocked like a bad engine every time the heat came on. The kitchen was barely wide enough for one person to stand in, and the windows rattled when the buses rolled past at night. She didn't complain about it. At 29, she had already learned that complaining didn't lower rent, fix a cracked ceiling, or make grief any lighter to carry. That Tuesday evening, she sat at the small table by the window with a bowl of canned tomato soup, half a grilled cheese sandwich, and a yellow legal pad covered in numbers she had already recalculated 3 times. Rent, utilities, gas, her mother's medication, the credit card she had been trying not to use. Her part-time housekeeping jobs covered just enough to keep everything from collapsing, but just enough had a cruel way of meaning one small disaster away from nothing. Her friend Laura, who had worked with her once at a hotel in Midtown, had called earlier that afternoon. There's a private household looking for someone, Laura had said. Good pay. Live in if you want it. They need someone who can do housework but also keep an eye on a teenage boy. More companion than nanny. Nina had almost laughed. Those jobs never go to women like me. Women like you are the only ones who can handle them, Laura had replied. Besides, the agency already saw your references. Nina looked again at the printed posting Laura had texted her. Private family estate seeks discreet, reliable household aid and companion support for teenage male. Excellent compensation. Room and board available. Experience with family care preferred. Absolute confidentiality required. The salary listed at the bottom had made her stare. It was nearly double what she made in a month. Jobs with that kind of money always had a catch. Sometimes the catch was impossible standards. Sometimes it was cruelty in polished clothes. Sometimes it was worse. Still, by 8 that night, she had sent in her paperwork. By noon the next day, they called. The woman on the phone spoke with clipped professionalism and the kind of authority that suggested she had spent years managing people who either feared her or depended on her. She introduced herself only as Mrs. Harris. "We've reviewed your background," she said. "Your references are strong." Nina frowned. "That was fast. We don't waste time. What exactly would I be doing?" "Helping maintain order in the residence, light household responsibilities, scheduling support. Most importantly, providing steady daily presence for a 16-year-old boy who has had a difficult year." The phrasing was careful. Too careful. Nina leaned against the counter in her tiny kitchen. "What kind of difficult year?" A short pause. "He lost his father." That changed the shape of the conversation immediately. Nina looked down at the water stain on the old counter and said nothing for a moment. She had lost her own father at 14. Different circumstances, same emptiness. A house could keep functioning after that kind of loss, but it never sounded the same. "I see," she said quietly. Mrs. Harris's voice softened by 1 degree. "The family requires discretion. The boy requires stability. We prefer someone who understands the difference between the two." Nina's instinct warned her that there was far more beneath those words than she was being told. But something else reached her too. The possibility that the job might actually matter. "When would you need me to start?" "Monday." "That soon?" "Yes." Nina looked around her apartment. The peeling paint above the sink, the stack of unpaid envelopes, the silence that settled after every phone call with her mother, when she had to pretend everything was manageable. "All right," she said. "I'll come." "Good," Mrs. Harris replied. "A car will pick you up at 9. By Monday morning, Nina had packed 1 suitcase, a garment bag, and a cardboard box of practical shoes and folded sweaters. Nothing about it felt glamorous. It felt like the kind of decision people made when their life was too tight in too many places and pride had become less useful than opportunity. The black town car waiting outside her building confirmed immediately that this was not an ordinary household. The driver loaded her luggage without a word. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Nina sat in silence as the city thinned around them, glass towers giving way to older neighborhoods, then long roads lined with bare trees and stone walls. The farther they drove, the more she felt the shift, not just in scenery, in class, in power. By the time the gates opened, she understood 2 things at once. First, that people with this kind of money lived by different laws, even when they didn't break any. And second, that nothing about the job ahead of her would be simple. The estate stood back from the road behind iron gates and winter-trimmed hedges. The house itself built in pale stone with tall windows, black shutters, and columns that belonged to another century. It wasn't flashy. It was worse than flashy. It was established. The kind of wealth that no longer needed to prove itself. Mrs. Harris was waiting at the front steps in a navy dress and a tailored coat. Posture straight enough to make the staff around her seem nervous by comparison. "Nina Carter," she said, extending one hand. "Yes, ma'am. Call me Mrs. Harris." Nina stepped out of the car. "Thank you for having me. We'll see if gratitude is the right response by the end of the week." It might have been a joke. The woman's expression gave nothing away. Inside, the house was immaculate. Dark wood, old paintings, fresh flowers, the faint scent of lemon polish and strong coffee. Men in suits moved through the far hall with the quiet purpose of people who belonged to security, not business. Nina noticed that immediately. Mrs. Harris noticed her noticing. "You'll concern yourself with the West Wing, the family kitchen, the upstairs hall, and the boys' schedule," she said as they walked. "You will not concern yourself with rooms that remain closed, conversations that are not addressed to you, or guests who do not introduce themselves." Nina kept walking. "Understood," Mrs. Harris stopped outside a set of double doors and turned to face her. The boy's name is Daniel. He is not rude by nature, only wounded. There is a difference. Learn it. I will. And one more thing, the older woman said. Yes, you are here to bring steadiness into a house that has had very little of it. Do that well, and your life becomes easier. Nina absorbed that in silence. Then the doors opened, and somewhere down the corridor, she heard a man's footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, unmistakably in command. She had not yet seen Victor Moretti for the first time, but even before she turned toward the sound, Nina understood with sudden clarity that she had already crossed the threshold into a world where money was only the surface, and whatever lay underneath it would cost far more. By the time Daniel came downstairs for breakfast that morning in the present, Nina had finished half her coffee and hidden every sign of the night before. Almost every sign, because when Victor entered the room a few minutes later, immaculate in a charcoal suit, his expression unreadable, she knew at once that the hallway had not been forgotten, not by him, and certainly not by her. By 8:30, Daniel Moretti had still not come downstairs. The breakfast tray remained untouched at the center of the long kitchen table. Scrambled eggs gone slightly cool, toast under a folded linen cloth, orange juice sweating in the glass. Morning light poured through the tall windows over the back lawn, too bright and clean for the heaviness hanging over the room. Nina stood near the counter with a legal pad in one hand and the day's school schedule in the other. Across from her, Mrs. Harris was speaking quietly with one of the cooks, but Nina could feel the older woman's attention shifting back toward the staircase every few seconds. He does this often? Nina asked. Mrs. Harris did not bother pretending not to understand the question. Often enough. Does anyone go get him? Mrs. Harris glanced at the clock. Someone usually tries. Whether he comes down is a different matter. Nina nodded once. The answer told her more than the words did. This was a household used to accommodation, but not peace. Used to waiting around the moods of a grieving teenager because no one had figured out how to reach him without breaking something else in the process. And grief, Nina knew, had a way of making a person look defiant when they were really just tired of hurting in public. She set down her coffee. I'll go. Mrs. Harris looked at her over the rim of her glasses. He may ignore you. He's allowed. He may be rude. He's allowed that too. That earned the faintest change in the older woman's face. Not a smile, something closer to approval. Second floor, Mrs. Harris said. Third door on the left. Nina crossed the foyer and climbed the wide staircase, the heels of her shoes softened by the thick runner laid down the center. In daylight, the house felt less intimidating than it had at midnight, but only slightly. Nothing here was accidental. The artwork, the polished banister, the quiet movement of staff at the edges of rooms, it all suggested a world where everything had been arranged by someone who expected obedience, and got it. At the top of the stairs, the hallway opened long and elegant before her. The same hallway. The memory of the night before passed over her in one sharp flash. Victor's voice, the wall at her back, the warning in his eyes. She pushed it away and kept walking. Daniel's door was half closed. Nina knocked lightly. No answer. She waited, then knocked again. Daniel, it's Nina. Still nothing. She opened the door a few inches. I'm coming in. The room inside was far less polished than the rest of the house. Clothes draped over a chair. A pair of sneakers kicked under the desk. Textbooks stacked in uneven piles beside a laptop. Dark curtains half drawn against the morning. There was money here, certainly, but also the disorder of a 16-year-old boy who had stopped caring whether anything stayed in place. Daniel sat on the far side of the bed, still in a t-shirt and sweatpants, looking out the window as if the yard beyond it held the answer to some question no one else could hear. He did not turn when she entered. Breakfast is downstairs, Nina said. I know. His voice wasn't angry, just flat. You'll be late for school. I know that too. Nina took in the untouched backpack on the floor, the tie hanging unused over the desk chair, the math worksheet face down near his elbow. Do you want me to leave? That made him glance at her. The expression on his face was older than it should have been. You can, he said. Everyone else usually does. Nina leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. I'm not everyone else. A beat passed. Daniel looked back out the window. That's what the last one said. Nina did not ask who the last one was. Tutor, nanny, counselor, private teacher. In houses like this, titles changed, but the pattern stayed the same. Someone arrived, tried too hard, spoke too gently or too much, then left the moment the work stopped feeling noble and started feeling impossible. She moved farther into the room and looked around once before settling her gaze on the framed photograph sitting crooked on the dresser. 3 people stood in it. A younger Daniel in a navy blazer, grinning despite missing one front tooth. A man in his 60s with silver at the temples and a hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Victor, younger too, though not by much, more relaxed around the mouth. One arm folded behind both of them as if even then he had already taken responsibility for holding the family together. The father, Nina recognized it instantly. Loss had a way of preserving certain smiles in photographs until they looked almost painful. "Your dad?" she asked quietly. Daniel's silence answered first. Then, "Yeah." Nina looked at the picture a moment longer. He looks like he laughed loud. That got Daniel to turn again, more fully this time. "What?" "In the picture," Nina said, "some people smile because someone told them to. Some people smile like they're trying not to laugh. He looks like the second kind." Daniel stared at her, suspicious and uncertain all at once. "You can tell that from a picture?" "Usually." He looked back at the photograph. His voice was smaller when he spoke again. He did laugh loud. Nina nodded once. "Those are the hardest people to lose." The room fell quiet. Not empty, quiet. Listening quiet. Daniel's shoulders dropped by half an inch, just enough for her to know she had reached the truth without pushing him toward it. "I'm not hungry," he said after a moment. "That's fine. I'm also not going to school. That may be less fine." He gave a humorless laugh at that. "So now you're going to convince me my future matters?" "No." That made him blink. "No speech about discipline," Nina continued. "No lecture about opportunities. No pretending one normal school day fixes grief." Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly, as if waiting for the trick. Nina pulled the desk chair away from the wall, turned it around, and sat in it backward, her arms resting loosely across the back. "But I am going to tell you this. If you stay in this room long enough, everyone else starts building their life around your sadness, and after a while, they stop helping because they don't know how." His jaw shifted. "That sounds like a speech." "It's not a speech," she said. "It's experience." Daniel studied her face. "You lost someone." "My father." "How old were you?" 14. He looked down at his hands. For the first time since she walked in, he did not seem guarded so much as tired. Deeply, bone-deep tired in the way only grief could make someone at 16. "Does it get better?" he asked. There it was. Not rudeness. Not defiance. The real question. Nina answered honestly. Because children who had suffered could smell performance faster than adults ever gave them credit for. "It gets different," she said. "People lie and say time heals everything. It doesn't. What time does is teach you how to carry it, without letting it make every decision for you." Daniel was quiet. Then, "That sounds depressing." Nina almost smiled. "It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true." He let out a breath through his nose and rubbed one hand over the back of his neck. "Everybody around here acts like I'm supposed to be over it by now. I doubt that. Victor does." Nina considered that before answering. "No. I think Victor acts like if he keeps moving, no one else is allowed to stop." Daniel looked up sharply. That had landed. "He wasn't like this before," the boy said. "Like what?" "Hard." Daniel glanced toward the closed door. "Or maybe he was, but not all the time. After my dad died, it got worse. He took over everything. The business, the house, me." He shrugged one shoulder. "I think he forgot I'm not one of his employees." Nina said nothing for a moment. From downstairs, faintly, she could hear the sounds of breakfast service continuing. Plates, a cabinet door, the ordinary sounds of a household doing its best to look ordinary. But up here, in the half-lit room of a grieving boy, truth sat closer to the surface. "Do you know what I think?" she asked. Daniel gave her a wary look. "That I should put on a tie and go to algebra? I think your brother is terrified." Daniel frowned. "Of me? Of failing you?" The answer seemed to unsettle him more than anything else she had said. "He doesn't act scared." People with power usually don't. Daniel looked at the floor, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Softer. Younger. He checked my room 3 times the night after the funeral. Nina stayed still. I wasn't asleep. Daniel went on. I just kept my eyes shut. He thought I didn't know. A pause. He still does it sometimes. That tightened something in Nina's chest. There it was again, that pattern she had already begun to see. Not tenderness spoken aloud. Protection disguised as control. Love wearing the wrong clothes because it had forgotten how to arrive any other way. Then maybe, she said quietly, he isn't hard because he doesn't care. Maybe he's hard because caring is the part he doesn't know how to survive. Daniel looked at her for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, a small crack appeared in the heaviness around his mouth. Not a smile. Exactly. The memory of one. You talk weird, he said. Nina let that one pass. I've been called worse. Probably by richer people. Definitely by richer people. That got the smallest real smile out of him. It changed his whole face. For one brief moment, Nina saw the boy from the photograph rather than the one grief had hollowed out. She stood and picked up the tie from the desk chair. Here's my offer. You go downstairs. You eat half your breakfast. You get through school. Then this afternoon, I help you with whatever assignments you've been ignoring. And I don't make one inspirational speech while doing it. Daniel took the tie from her hand. And if I say no, then I come back up in 20 minutes and annoy you again. His mouth twitched. That sounds like a threat. It is. He looked down at the tie, then at the backpack on the floor. Finally, with the reluctance of someone agreeing to move a mountain one pebble at a time, he stood up. I hate geometry, he muttered. Most decent people do. As Daniel reached for his blazer, Nina turned toward the door. When she opened it, she stopped. Victor Moretti was standing in the hallway. Not close enough to make it obvious he had been listening. Not far enough to make it believable that he had not. His face revealed nothing. Suit immaculate. Expression controlled. But his eyes moved first to Daniel, then to Nina, and something unreadable passed through them. Daniel noticed him and stiffened. I'm coming downstairs. Victor's gaze stayed on Nina one beat longer than necessary. Then he gave a single nod. Good. Just one word. Calm, neutral, ordinary. But Nina understood at once that something had shifted. Not resolved, not softened. Shifted, because Daniel had stepped out of his room, because Nina had reached him where others had failed, and because in a house built on silence, power, and old grief, that kind of small victory did not go unnoticed. As she followed Daniel down the staircase a moment later, Nina became aware of the empty chair at the breakfast table, the one at the far end that no one seemed to use. The chair no one had moved, no one had replaced, no one had dared fill. The father's place. In some families, grief shouted. In this one, it sat quietly at the table every morning and waited to see who would acknowledge it. And for the first time since entering the Moretti house, Nina understood the true shape of her work. She was not here to clean rooms or straighten schedules. She was here to help the living learn how to sit beside the dead without letting the dead rule the house. That was harder work, and far more dangerous. By the end of that first week, the house had begun to reveal its rhythm, not its secrets. Those remained carefully guarded behind closed doors, lowered voices, and the kind of silence money could afford to maintain. But rhythms were harder to hide. They lived in ordinary things the hour Daniel finally came downstairs without being called twice. The exact moment Mrs. Harris inspected the flower arrangements in the front hall. The way the kitchen staff lowered their voices when Victor entered a room, even if he said nothing at all. Nina learned quickly. Breakfast with Daniel at 8. School drop-off by the driver at 8:30, unless Victor insisted on handling it himself, which happened rarely and always without explanation. Household tasks through late morning. Daniel's return just after 3. Homework, reading, a supervised attempt at order. Dinner at 7, though Victor was often late. It should have felt simple. It did not. Because even as the routine settled, Nina became increasingly aware of another pattern woven quietly through it. Victor's presence. Not constant. Precise. He appeared in places that made no practical sense. The library when she was organizing Daniel's history notes. The back terrace, when she was helping one of the gardeners bring in potted herbs before a cold snap. The kitchen late at night when she came downstairs for tea instead of water, dressed more carefully now, though she hated herself a little for thinking in those terms. He never lingered long. A question about Daniel's progress, a comment about the weather, a reminder about a school meeting. Nothing improper, nothing anyone else could point to. But it was enough that Nina began to feel it before she saw him the shift in a room when his attention landed there. That Thursday afternoon, she sat with Daniel in the sunroom off the west wing, a stack of English papers between them and a chemistry textbook opened face down at the edge of the table. Outside, the March wind bent the hedges in slow waves. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old books, lemon polish, and the coffee Daniel had reheated twice without drinking. "Your thesis makes no sense," Nina said, circling a sentence with her pen. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "That sounds harsh." "It sounds accurate." He reached for the paper. "You said no inspirational speeches, not no emotional damage. I also said I would help you pass 11th grade English, which requires honesty." He took the paper back with a groan. "I hate essays." "You hate anything involving complete sentences." "That's not true. I like texting." Nina looked up just long enough to give him a flat look. Daniel smirked and dropped his gaze to the paper again. Over the past 10 days, that had become more common, those quick flashes of boyish humor breaking through the heaviness. They never lasted long, but they were real. And in this house, real mattered. He scratched out a line and rewrote it more carefully. "What if I say grief is like carrying a broken compass?" he asked after a minute. Nina considered it. Too poetic for an American public school teacher who makes 12th graders read Steinbeck for fun. Daniel sighed. "You ruin everything. I refine everything." A movement at the doorway pulled her attention up. Victor stood there with one hand in his pocket, suit jacket still on despite the late hour, his expression unreadable in the afternoon light. He looked from Daniel's paper to Nina's pen, then to the half-finished coffee on the table. "How is he doing?" he asked. Daniel muttered without looking up. "I'm right here." Victor's eyes remained on Nina. "I asked how you were doing, not whether you existed." That should have sounded dry. It came out almost gentle. Daniel made a face but did not argue. That alone told Nina more than either brother intended. "He's improving," she said. "When he remembers that writing complete paragraphs won't kill him." Victor stepped into the room. A bold claim. Daniel tossed his pen down. "Can one of you pick a personality? If she's going to insult me, I need you to defend me." "That's how this works." The corner of Victor's mouth moved barely, but unmistakably. Nina noticed. So did Daniel. It made the younger brother sit up straighter with visible satisfaction, as if he had just proven a private theory. Victor moved closer to the table and picked up the marked essay. His eyes scanned the page, quick and precise. "You wrote this?" he asked Daniel, with assistance from the tyrant. Victor handed the paper back, then listened to the tyrant. Daniel muttered something under his breath. "What was that?" Victor asked. "I said," Daniel replied more clearly, "you're both impossible." Victor ignored him and turned to Nina. "A word." The request was quiet. It still landed like an order. Nina set down her pen. "Daniel, rewrite the second paragraph. Cut the dramatic metaphors." He groaned. "You two are so sure I won't eavesdrop later." "You absolutely will," she said. "Try not to be obvious about it." That earned a reluctant grin from him before she followed Victor into the hallway. He led her only as far as the adjoining library, leaving the door half open behind them. It was a small thing, but deliberate. Privacy without impropriety. Control without room for gossip. Victor stopped near the fireplace and turned to face her. For a moment, he said nothing. Nina had begun to understand that silence was one of his tools. He used it the way other men used volume to make people fill the space, to reveal themselves before he ever had to. She did not help him. "Finally," he said. "Daniel laughs more with you." It wasn't a question. "He's still grieving," Nina replied. "Laughing doesn't change that." "No." Victor's gaze held hers. "But it changes the room." The words were simple. The way he said them was not. Nina folded her hands lightly in front of her. "He needed steadiness, and you gave it to him." There was no flattery in Victor's tone, no warmth either, just fact. Somehow that made it more intimate. I gave him consistency, she said. That's different. Victor's eyes shifted over her face as if weighing that answer against something he had already observed. Most people in this house have been trying to manage him. And you don't. No. Nina held his gaze. I speak to him like he still belongs to the world. Something changed in Victor's expression then, slight but unmistakable. Not surprise. Recognition. He looked away first, toward the row of dark windows overlooking the lawn. When our father died, he said, everyone either spoke to Daniel like he was breakable or ignored him entirely. I had no patience for either. Nina kept still. This was the most he had said to her voluntarily outside of command or warning. And what did you choose? She asked. Victor gave a humorless half-smile. Work, structure, security. The things I could control. That's not the same as grief, Nina said quietly. No. He turned back toward her. It isn't. The fire in the library had burned low. Orange light moved softly against the dark wood shelves, throwing restless shadows across the room. Nina became aware again of how large he was in confined spaces, not just physically. In effect, Victor did not merely occupy rooms. He altered them. You've done this before, he said. What? This kind of work, she almost smiled. Keeping people from falling apart? Yes. No, Nina answered honestly. But I know what it looks like when a family starts speaking around pain instead of through it. He studied her again, longer now. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Harris says you haven't complained once. Nina lifted a brow. Should I start? Victor's gaze dropped, just briefly, to her mouth before returning to her eyes. That sounds dangerously close to humor. Maybe I'm adjusting. To the work? To the house? He took in that answer without comment. But something in the air between them sharpened. Not conflict. Awareness. Victor moved toward the sideboard, where a crystal decanter sat untouched beside two glasses. He poured water into one and handed it to her without asking. Nina accepted it. Thank you. He poured one for himself but did not drink. After a pause, he said, There's a parent meeting at Daniel's school next Tuesday. College planning, summer programs, the usual manufactured panic. I want you there. The request caught her slightly off guard. As staff? As the person who actually knows whether he's doing the work. Nina considered that. Will you be there? Victor looked at her over the rim of his glass. Is that relevant? Yes. A faint pause. Then, I will. She nodded once. Then I'll be there too. Another silence settled. This one was different, less guarded, more dangerous for that reason. Victor set his glass down on the sideboard with measured care. You're not afraid of me, Nina answered just as carefully. That would depend on the day. That almost amused him. Almost. You should be, he said. Because of your reputation? His face changed by so little most people would have missed it. But Nina saw it, the tightening at the jaw, the cold awareness behind his eyes. Because this is not a safe world, he said. And the longer you stay in this house, the harder it will be to pretend otherwise. The honesty in that landed harder than any threat could have. Nina took a sip of water, buying herself 1 second more than she needed. Then perhaps the question is not whether the world is safe. Victor waited. It's whether the people in it are worth the risk. For the first time since she had met him, Victor said nothing at all. Not because he had run out of answers, because she had given him one he did not want. From the adjoining room came the sound of Daniel dropping his pen, followed by a muttered curse and the scrape of his chair. The ordinary noise broke whatever had formed between them. Victor stepped back first, control returning, distance restored. Finish the essay, he said. Nina almost smiled. Was that directed at me? Or your brother? At both of you. He moved toward the door, then stopped beside it. Without turning fully, he said, For what it's worth, the house is quieter when Daniel trusts someone. Nina looked at him. And does he? Victor's profile remained unreadable. He came downstairs the first morning because of you. Then he left. Nina stayed where she was for a moment longer, the glass cool in her hand, her pulse less steady than she wanted to admit. It wasn't what he had said that unsettled her. It was the restraint in it, the fact that gratitude seemed harder for Victor Moretti than anger, the fact that every word between them still felt like part warning, part confession. The fact that in a house run by control, the smallest signs of trust had begun to feel more intimate than touch. When she returned to the sunroom, Daniel was still slumped over his essay with performative misery. He looked up the moment she entered. That took too long. Nina resumed her chair. Your grammar was safer than this conversation. Daniel narrowed his eyes with far too much interest. That sounds suspicious. It was a school meeting. Liar. Nina uncapped her pen. Write your conclusion. Daniel leaned back and studied her face in a way that was unnervingly similar to his brother. Why are your cheeks pink? It's warm in here. It's March. It's heated. He smiled slowly. Interesting. Nina pointed to the paper. One more word and I add another paragraph. Daniel bent over the essay again, but not before muttering, I knew it. Knew what? Without looking up, he said, Nothing yet. The phrasing was casual. It still lodged in Nina's mind. Nothing yet. Outside, the wind pressed branches softly against the window pane. Inside, the old house held its breath around them, as if listening for the shape of something not yet spoken aloud. And by the time dinner was served that evening, Nina understood one thing clearly. Victor Moretti was no longer simply watching her. He was measuring how much of himself she had already begun to change. The following Tuesday began with polished shoes, controlled voices, and the kind of manufactured civility that always seemed to accompany private schools charging more per year than most families earned in 6. The college planning meeting was held in a paneled room overlooking the athletic fields, where framed photographs of rowing teams and debate champions lined the walls in quiet testimony to old money and inherited confidence. Parents sat in tailored coats and conservative pearls, speaking in the measured tones of people who treated anxiety as something to be managed discreetly. Nina sat beside Daniel with a folder on her lap, listening as the guidance counselor discussed summer programs, standardized testing, and pathways to prestige as though the right schedule could protect a child from sorrow. Victor arrived 5 minutes late. Not rushed, never rushed. He entered the room in a charcoal overcoat and dark suit, offering a brief apology that made the headmaster himself stand straighter. Heads turned. A few fathers recognized him. A few mothers looked as though they wished they had not. Victor took the empty chair on Daniel's other side and said nothing more. But the room changed. Power did that. Real power, Nina had learned, didn't need to announce itself. It altered the air simply by entering it. The counselor resumed speaking, though now with slightly more caution than before. Daniel's grades had improved. His attendance was steady, and his teachers had noticed stronger participation. His English instructor praised a recent essay about grief and resilience. His math teacher was encouraged by progress. His chemistry teacher requested less daydreaming and more lab precision. Daniel slumped lower in his seat. This is humiliating. It's called education, Nina murmured. It's called public execution. Victor did not look at either of them. Be grateful they're discussing your grades and not your posture. Daniel gave him a look. Nina had to lower her eyes to hide the edge of a smile. The meeting ended with handshakes, brochures, and the soft clatter of affluent concern. Outside, parents drifted toward the parking lot in pairs, discussing tutors, lacrosse, and financial markets. Daniel was pulled aside by a classmate asking about an upcoming history project, leaving Nina and Victor briefly alone in the corridor near a display case of old yearbooks. Victor buttoned his coat with one smooth movement. You handled that well. It was a school meeting, not a hostage negotiation. The corner of his mouth moved. For this school, the difference is often negligible. Nina glanced through the glass doors where Daniel stood talking. He did better than he expected. He does better when you're there. The statement was simple. The weight beneath it was not. Before Nina could answer, a man in an expensive navy coat approached from the far end of the hall. Mid-50s, silver watch, the kind of face that smiled without warmth. Victor Moretti, the man said, offering a hand. Been a while. Victor's body changed so subtly most people would have missed it. His shoulders remained loose, his face calm, but everything in him sharpened. Not long enough, Warren, he said. The man's eyes flicked briefly to Nina, then back. I heard your brother was doing better. He is. Good. The man smiled faintly. Your father would have wanted that. Silence dropped between them. Not awkward. Dangerous. Nina looked from one man to the other and understood immediately that whatever history existed here was not fit for a school hallway. Victor's voice stayed even. You should go home to your own family, Warren. The man's smile thinned. Always direct. And you're always somewhere you shouldn't be. Warren let that pass with the grace of someone used to veiled threats. He nodded once toward Nina. Good afternoon. Nina returned the nod but said nothing. By the time he walked away, Daniel was back. Who was that? He asked. Victor adjusted his cuff. Someone irrelevant. Daniel frowned. You only say that when people are very relevant. Then perhaps you should stop listening so carefully. They drove home in near silence, Daniel in the back seat with headphones around his neck, Nina beside him, Victor across from the driver in the forward-facing seat of the town car. Rain had begun halfway down the highway, streaking the windows and dulling the world outside into gray motion. Nina became aware of Victor's attention before she looked up. He was watching the rain, not her. But the stillness in him felt strained, not angry, occupied. By the time the car passed through the estate gates, she knew with uneasy certainty that something from the school corridor had followed him home. It showed itself at dinner. Victor barely touched his food. Daniel noticed it too, though he pretended not to. Mrs. Harris noticed everything and said nothing. At 8:15, two men in dark suits arrived through the side entrance and disappeared into the east wing without being announced. At 8:23, a third arrived. The staff moved around it as though this was ordinary. Perhaps it was. Nina was in the family kitchen, finishing the inventory notes Mrs. Harris had asked her to organize when the first raised voice carried faintly from down the hall. Not shouting. Worse than shouting. The kind of hard, restrained male anger that suggested the room it came from had already made peace with violence. Mrs. Harris looked up from the silverware drawer and shut it gently. Finish what you're doing, she said. Nina set down her pen. Who was that man at the school? Mrs. Harris's eyes lifted to hers. A question you don't need answered. He upset Victor. Many things upset Mr. Moretti. That's not the same as being threatened. The older woman's face did not change, but the silence that followed confirmed enough. Nina, she said at last, there are families with power, and there are families who had to learn what power costs. This house belongs to the second kind. Another voice sounded from the east wing, sharper, then quiet. Nina stood. I should check on Daniel. You should do no such thing. Mrs. Harris's tone had gained steel now. But upstairs, a door opened. A minute later, Daniel came down the back staircase, wearing a gray sweatshirt and no shoes. His face tight in the way boys tried to hide fear by arranging it as annoyance. What's going on? He asked. Mrs. Harris answered first. Nothing you need to involve yourself in. That means something is definitely happening. He looked toward the east corridor. So did Nina. Then a crash sounded from somewhere behind the closed office doors. Not glass exactly. Furniture, maybe. Something heavy, striking wood. Daniel moved before either woman could stop him. Daniel, Nina said sharply. He froze halfway down the hall. Not because of her. Because Victor had just emerged from the east wing. He was no longer wearing his jacket. One sleeve was rolled halfway up. His expression was composed in the way storm clouds were composed. Dense, dark, and one wrong degree away from breaking. Daniel straightened instinctively. I just wanted to know if... You're going upstairs, Victor said. I'm not a child. You are tonight. The answer cut clean. Daniel bristled. You can't just say that every time. Upstairs. The command hit harder this time. Nina watched the younger brother's face tighten. Grief and resentment flashing together so quickly they were nearly the same emotion. He opened his mouth, ready to argue, then saw something in Victor's expression that changed his mind. Without another word, Daniel turned and went back toward the stairs. Victor didn't look at Nina until Daniel disappeared. When he finally did, the force of that gaze was immediate and unsettling. Come with me, he said. Mrs. Harris went very still. Nina should have refused. Should have asked why. Should have remembered every instinct that told her this house had locked doors for a reason. Instead, she followed him. Victor led her not to the office, but to the smaller library off the west hall. The room smelled of leather, old paper, and rain seeping cold against the windows. He closed the door behind them. Not slammed, closed, deliberately. For a moment, he stood with his back to her, both hands braced on the edge of a sideboard beneath a row of black and white family photographs. When he turned, his face was calm again. Too calm. "The man you saw at school," he said, "worked with my father." Nina said nothing. Victor crossed the room slowly. "You've already figured out that my family is not ordinary. That would be hard to miss." "No," he said. "What you've noticed so far is money, security, caution. I'm talking about the structure underneath it." Rain tapped softly at the window. Nina held his gaze. "Then say it plainly." Something like approval flickered through his eyes. "My father built an empire," Victor said. "Some of it legal, some of it tolerated, some of it neither." The meaning landed before the words fully finished. Nina stayed very still. Victor went on, voice flat with the burden of old fact. "Shipping, protection, debt collection. Favors traded where the law failed and consequences were needed. By the time I was old enough to understand it, our name already meant two things in this city. Safety to some people, fear to others." Nina's throat tightened slightly. "You're telling me your family is mob." Victor's expression did not change. "I'm telling you my father ran organized crime until he decided too late that he wanted out." The room seemed to narrow around them. "And when he tried?" Nina asked quietly. "He died. No hesitation, no euphemism. Not in some dramatic street execution," Victor added. "Not the way movies like to imagine men like him dying. A quiet betrayal, a quiet arrangement. One of his own people sold the route of his car. The brakes failed on a curve outside White Plains." Nina stared at him. Somewhere beneath the cold precision of the story, she heard the shape of a son who had been forced to turn grief into function before grief had finished with him. "You were there?" she asked. "I got there before the police." His jaw tightened once. "Daniel was still waiting for our father to come home for dinner." Silence filled the library. Not empty. Human. Nina thought of the untouched chair at breakfast. The night checks outside Daniel's door. The house built on structure because structure was the only thing standing between this family and collapse. "So you took over," she said. "I had no choice." "There is always a choice." Victor's eyes hardened. "Not when a boy of 16 inherits your last name, and every man who profited under your father starts calculating whether that makes him vulnerable." That answer struck with brutal clarity. For the first time, Nina saw the full outline of the world she had entered. Not glamour, not mystery, a system of loyalty and threat, grief and power, stitched together by men who believed protection and control were the same act. "And Warren?" she asked. "Warren thinks fear is a renewable resource." Victor looked toward the rain-slicked glass. "Men like him respect only weakness and leverage. He came to the school today to remind me he's still looking for both." "Nina, let that settle. Why are you telling me this now?" Victor looked back at her. Because he was many things, she thought in that moment, but careless was not one of them. If he was speaking, he had already decided silence had become more dangerous. "Because you live in this house," he said. "Because Daniel trusts you. Because if you remain near my brother, you remain near me. And because I don't permit half-truths to linger once they become liabilities." The words were hard. The honesty beneath them was harder. Nina folded her hands lightly to keep them steady. "And what exactly are you expecting me to do with this information?" "Decide." The answer came immediately. Victor stepped closer, not threatening now, just impossible to ignore. "You may leave," he said. "I'll make certain you're compensated generously, given references, relocated if necessary. No damage to your reputation, no questions asked. And if I stay?" His eyes held hers with terrible steadiness. "Then you stay knowing what this is," he said. "You stay understanding that there are parts of my life that carry danger no decent woman should have to absorb by accident." Nina exhaled slowly. It would have been easier if he had lied. Easier if he had minimized it. Easier if he had wrapped brutality in charm and let her discover the truth too late. Instead, he had put the truth between them like a loaded weapon, and asked her to choose whether she would remain in the room. "You think I'm fragile," she said. "No." His voice dropped. "I think you're too decent for this." The sentence struck deeper than she expected. Outside, the rain continued against the windows in soft, persistent taps, like time knocking where memory already lived. Nina thought of Daniel asking whether grief ever got better. She thought of Victor at the school corridor, all control and contained violence. She thought of the father's empty chair and the cost of silence in this house. Then she met Victor's eyes and asked the only honest question left. "If I stay," she said, "what happens?" Something dark and conflicted moved through his expression. Then boundaries become harder to maintain. It was not a confession. It was worse, because it was restraint admitting how thin it had become. Nina's pulse shifted once, hard and unmistakable. Victor saw it. Of course he saw it. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why I'm giving you a choice now." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Nina answered, "I'm staying." Victor went still, not surprised, not relieved, stilled in the way a man goes still when something he wanted becomes real enough to fear. "You should think longer than that," he said. "I already have. You don't know enough." "No," Nina replied. "But I know Daniel needs someone in this house who isn't ruled by fear, and I know you didn't tell me the truth to trap me. You told me because some part of you still cares whether I walked into this blindly." Victor's face changed by almost nothing, yet she felt the impact of her words land. "You make dangerous assumptions," he said, "and you hide truths inside warnings." That nearly broke something in him. Not visibly. Internally, she could feel it. At last he gave one slow nod, as if accepting a verdict he did not entirely trust himself to want. "Then stay," he said. Nina held his gaze. "I intend to." Victor looked at her for one beat longer than necessary, then stepped back and opened the library door. Control returned to the room at once. But now, she knew what it cost him. As Nina walked out into the hall, she understood that the house had changed again. Not outwardly. The staff still moved with practiced discretion. Mrs. Harris still inspected the silver. Daniel still dragged one foot on the stairs when he was tired. But beneath all of it, the truth had shifted into place. Victor Moretti was no longer only the man who ran the house. He was the man standing between that house and a world waiting for weakness. And Nina, by choosing to stay, had just stepped knowingly into the space beside him. For 3 days after the conversation in the library, the house moved under a new kind of tension. Not louder, sharper. Nina felt it in the pauses between words, in the way Victor seemed to appear and disappear with even greater precision than before, in the way Daniel watched both of them with the unsettling perception of a boy who had learned too early how to read rooms built on secrets. Nothing overt happened. That was what made it worse. Victor did not withdraw from her, but neither did he cross the line he had finally admitted existed. He remained controlled in public, exact in private, and somehow more dangerous for the effort. He asked about Daniel's assignments. He reviewed the driver schedule. He corrected a florist delivery that had arrived with the wrong arrangement for the dining room. Ordinary things. House things. But every exchange between him and Nina now carried the weight of knowledge underneath it. She knew what he was. He knew she had chosen to stay anyway. And choice, Nina was beginning to understand, was a far more intimate thing than flirtation. Daniel noticed the change before anyone said a word. Friday afternoon found him in the study with a history book open and absolutely no interest in the chapter before him. Nina sat across from him, marking up a worksheet while rain tapped lightly at the tall windows. The weather had turned again, cold and gray, making the house feel older than it looked. "You two are being weird," Daniel said without looking up. Nina kept writing. "That's a broad statement. It's an accurate one." She set down her pen. "Do you plan to pass U.S. history through observation alone?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Victor keeps asking me if I finished assignments he never used to care about specifically, which means he's trying to sound normal and failing. You've started answering him in full sentences like every word costs money, which means you're trying to sound normal and also failing." Nina gave him a level look. "Your powers of deduction are wasted on adolescence." Daniel smirked faintly. "So, I'm right. You're dramatic." "That's not a no." Before she could respond, the study door opened. Victor entered without knocking, one hand holding his phone, the other already loosening his cuff. His expression was unreadable, though Nina saw the strain beneath it immediately. "Daniel," he said, "your tutor for advanced calculus is moving from Monday to Wednesday." Daniel frowned. "I don't have an advanced calculus tutor." Victor looked at him. "You do now. That feels like punishment." "It's preparation," Daniel slumped deeper in his chair. Same thing. Victor's gaze moved to Nina. It lingered only a moment, but that moment was enough to unsettle her concentration. I need the study after 6, he said. For what? Daniel asked. A meeting. Those are always bad. Victor's expression didn't change. Then stay out of the East Wing, and you won't have to concern yourself with it. Daniel muttered something under his breath. Victor ignored him and turned to leave. Then he stopped and looked back at Nina. A word. Daniel made a quiet sound of exaggerated interest. Nina shot him a warning look before following Victor into the hall. He did not take her far this time. Just to the alcove outside the study windows, where rain blurred the garden into silver and dark green. There will be people here tonight, he said. More than usual. Nina waited. I want you and Daniel upstairs by 9. Because of Warren? Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, in calculation. Because I said so, he answered. That's not a reason. It's the one you have. Nina crossed her arms. You told me the truth in that library because you said you didn't allow half-truths once they became liabilities. Don't go backward now. For a second, he simply looked at her. Then he exhaled once through his nose, the nearest thing to visible patience she had seen from him all week. There's pressure building, he said. Warren is not the only man testing boundaries. When men like that feel uncertainty, they create noise. Tonight, maybe noise. And you don't want Daniel near it. No. Or me. Or, Victor's gaze held hers. No. The directness in that answer struck low and deep. Nina lowered her voice. You can't protect everyone from everything. No, he said quietly. But I can still decide what enters my house. Their eyes held for a beat too long. Then footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor, one of the staff, passing quickly with folded linens. The moment closed at once. Victor stepped back. 9 o'clock. Nina nodded. Fine. He looked as though he wanted to say something else. Instead, he returned to the study. That night, the house changed shape after dinner. Cars arrived through the side gate, one after another, tires hissing on wet stone. Men entered in dark coats and polished shoes, some carrying umbrellas they never opened, others moving bareheaded through the rain as if weather was beneath notice. Voices remained low. Doors closed softly. The east wing seemed to draw all sound toward it without ever fully releasing any. By 8:45, Daniel had stopped pretending to read. He stood at the upstairs landing in socks and a navy sweater, staring toward the staircase below while Nina folded laundry from the basket Mrs. Harris had left near the sitting room. Do you think he's expecting trouble? Daniel asked. Nina folded a towel with careful precision. I think your brother expects trouble the way some people expect weather. That sounds unhealthy. It sounds earned. Daniel glanced at her. You like him. The towel in Nina's hands stilled, though only for a second. That is not a conversation we're having. That's not a denial. It's also not your business. Daniel gave her a look too old for 16. In this house, everyone's feelings become everyone's business eventually. Nina almost told him he was wrong. Then a sharp sound rose from below. Not a gunshot. Not quite a shout. Something hard striking wood, followed by the unmistakable edge of male anger. Daniel went still. Nina set the towel down. Another voice followed, muffled by distance, but aggressive enough that the words themselves were less important than the tone. Daniel moved toward the stairs. No, Nina said at once. He's down there. I know. He could be. He knows exactly what he's doing. Daniel looked back at her, fear stripped bare under adolescent stubbornness. You don't know that. She crossed the room and caught his arm. Not hard, just firm enough to stop him. I know this, she said quietly. If you go down there in the middle of whatever this is, you make yourself the center of it. And if your brother is trying to keep you out of danger, that helps no one. Daniel's jaw clenched. For one terrible second she thought he would pull away. Then the shouting below cut off abruptly. Silence swallowed the house. Heavy. Waiting. A minute later there were footsteps in the hall below. Then another set. Fast. Purposeful. Crossing toward the study. Daniel looked at Nina. Something's wrong. Before she could answer, the intercom on the upstairs wall clicked once. Mrs. Harris's voice came through, calm and clipped. Nina. Mr. Moretti needs you in the study. Daniel's eyes widened. Why? Nina didn't know. That was the problem. She left Daniel in the upstairs sitting room with strict instructions not to move, then headed down the staircase with her pulse beating harder than she wanted to admit. The first floor seemed too still. The family rooms were empty. The air smelled faintly of rain, whiskey, and something else she recognized a second later with cold clarity. Blood. The study door was open. Victor stood inside beside the desk, sleeves rolled up, tie gone, one knuckle split and reddening. On the carpet near the hearth lay broken glass from what had once been a tumbler. Two laptops sat open on the desk. One of them wasn't his. Mrs. Harris stood near the bookcase, her expression carved from stone. Beside her, a man from security Nina had seen twice before was speaking in low tones into an earpiece. Victor looked up the moment Nina entered. There was no softness in his face at all. Only fury held so tightly it had become cold. "Close the door," he said. Nina did. The click of the latch sounded far too final. "What happened?" she asked. Victor stepped around the desk. "Someone accessed files from inside this house." Nina frowned. "What kind of files?" "The kind that can get men killed." The room seemed to contract. "Who?" she asked. Victor's eyes locked on hers. "That," he said, "is exactly what I'm trying to determine." Nina felt something shift in the air then. Not merely tension, direction. She understood a second too late. Victor moved closer. "Did you enter my office today?" he asked. The question hit like a slap. "No." "Did you touch anything in here?" "No." "Did you speak to anyone about the East Wing, about Warren, about tonight's meeting?" "No." Each answer came faster than the last, less from panic than disbelief. Victor stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the fine spray of rain still damp at the shoulder of his shirt. Close enough to know the blood on his hand was fresh. "The breach came from inside the house," he said. Nina stared at him. "And you think that means me? I think you arrived 3 months ago. I think Daniel trusts you. I think I told you more than I should have. And I think someone accessed protected files less than an hour after a room full of men started discussing information nobody outside that room should know." His voice never rose. It didn't need to. The accusation sat fully formed between them. Mrs. Harris remained silent. The security man kept his eyes carefully lowered. Nina's chest tightened, not with fear at first, but with something hotter, something wounded. "You cannot be serious." Victor's face hardened. "In my world, seriousness is the only luxury that matters. I didn't touch your office. That isn't enough." Her voice sharpened. "Then what is enough?" For one fraction of a second, pain flickered beneath his anger. Then it was gone. "Proof," he said. Nina laughed once, not because anything was funny, because disbelief had nowhere else to go. "You told me the truth," she said. "You asked me to choose whether to stay. I stayed. And the first moment things go wrong, you decide I must have been lying all along." Victor's jaw flexed. "I decide nothing without evidence. Then why am I standing here?" That landed. For the first time since she entered, the room felt human again because now everyone in it could hear the hurt underneath the anger. Victor took one more step forward. "Because I need to know whether what's between us has made me careless." The words stunned the room into deeper silence. Nina stared at him. "What's between us?" Not denied, not softened, used here like an exposed wire. And somehow that made the accusation worse. She drew in a breath and spoke with a steadiness that cost her something. "You do not get to stand there and tell me I matter enough to warn me, matter enough to be dangerous, matter enough to stay and then look at me like I'm some woman sent here to betray you." Victor's eyes darkened. "You don't understand what betrayal costs." "No," Nina said quietly. "But I understand what distrust does." He held her gaze. Neither of them moved. Then, from somewhere down the hall, a phone began to ring. Sharp, insistent, terribly ordinary. No one reached for it. The sound kept cutting through the silence while the fracture between them widened in real time. At last, Victor looked away first. Not in surrender, in strain. That hurt more than if he had kept staring. Nina turned toward the door. "If you want proof," she said without looking back, "find it." Then she left the study with her spine straight, her pulse pounding, and the clear, terrible knowledge that in a house built on loyalty, she had just learned exactly how quickly fear could turn even truth into suspicion. Upstairs, Daniel was waiting by the landing. all restless limbs and anxious eyes. He stood the moment he saw her face. What happened? Nina looked past him toward the dark windows, where rain still moved in thin silver lines against the glass. The house felt different now, not merely dangerous, broken open, and somewhere below them, Victor Moretti was still standing in the wreckage of his own fear, mistaking it for evidence. He made a mistake, she said at last. Daniel frowned. About what? Nina forced herself to answer steadily. About me, and for the first time since she entered the Moretti estate, staying no longer felt like an act of courage. It felt like standing inside a fire and realizing too late that loyalty, no matter how honestly given, was still no match for a man who had built his life around expecting betrayal. The next morning arrived with a brittle kind of quiet. Rain had stopped before dawn, but the sky remained low and colorless, pressing pale light against the tall windows of the estate. Nina had slept badly, if at all. Not because she was afraid. Fear would have been simpler. Fear could be answered with distance, caution, plans. What kept her awake was disappointment. Victor had not merely doubted her. He had looked at her through the lens of every betrayal that had ever shaped him and decided, for one cold and unforgivable moment, that she belonged there too. By 7:30, she was downstairs in the kitchen, dressed with more precision than usual in a dark skirt and a white blouse buttoned high at the throat. The coffee in her hand had gone lukewarm before she remembered to drink it. Mrs. Harris entered through the service door carrying the morning inventory sheet. She took one look at Nina and seemed to understand immediately that politeness would be an insult. He hasn't slept, the older woman said quietly. Nina did not ask how she knew. That doesn't make him right. No, Mrs. Harris replied. It doesn't. That answer surprised her more than comfort would have. Mrs. Harris set the papers on the counter and removed her gloves one finger at a time. The house is secure. The files were not moved off-site. Whoever did it was interrupted. Nina looked up. And security has been reviewing internal access logs since 4 in the morning. Mrs. Harris's expression remained calm, but her voice had hardened. I told him last night he was letting old ghosts do fresh damage. Nina stared at her. You said that to Victor? I've worked for this family for 19 years, Mrs. Harris said. There are privileges that come with surviving that long. For the first time since leaving the study, Nina felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not yet, but the first sign that the house itself had not accepted the accusation as fact. Daniel came in 10 minutes later, hair damp from a rushed shower, tie hanging untied around his neck. He looked from Nina to Mrs. Harris and read the room at once. He's in his office, he said to Nina, not bothering to identify who he meant. I assumed. Daniel stood by the coffee pot, not touching it. He's been in a mood since 5. Nina gave him a flat look. Your brother lives in a mood. A reluctant flicker of humor crossed his face, then disappeared. You're still mad? Yes. Good. That stopped her. Good? Daniel shrugged one shoulder, more vulnerable than casual. Somebody should be. The simple honesty of that landed deeper than he knew. Breakfast passed with Victor absent. By 9, Daniel had gone to school. The house had resumed its ordinary choreography, and Nina was in the west sitting room reorganizing the weekly meal calendar when footsteps approached across the hallway. She knew they were his before he spoke. Victor stopped in the doorway. He looked worse than he had the night before. Not disordered, Victor Moretti would have had to be half dead to appear disordered, but stripped down in some invisible way. His suit was immaculate, his hair combed back, his face composed, yet the strain beneath it was undeniable now, as if the effort of control had cost him sleep and found no mercy in return. Nina, she did not rise from the desk. Mr. Moretti, that formality hit its mark. He felt it. A long second passed. Then Victor stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Not locked, closed. The gesture stirred something bitter in her chest. Too much in this house happened behind closed doors. If this is another interrogation, she said, you should save your time. It isn't. She waited. Victor held her gaze for one beat, then said, we found the breach. The words were clean, direct, no hedging. Nina set down her pen very carefully. And it wasn't you. Something hot flashed through her, not vindication. Exactly. Wounded pride had no interest in triumph. Only in truth. I'm aware of that, she said. Victor accepted the blow without flinching. The access came through a mirrored login routed from Isabella's credentials. She copied a temporary security token from one of my internal files 2 weeks ago and planted a ghost session inside the system. Last night, during the meeting, she tried to pull the shipping routes and names attached to the Warren account. Nina stared at him. Isabella. So there had been someone else after all. Someone already inside the walls. Someone trusted enough to get close. Who is she? Nina asked. Someone who used to work in Milan. His voice flattened further. Someone who thought proximity to me was the same thing as access. And now? Victor's eyes cooled. Now she's gone. The answer was not comforting. Nina looked away first, not out of weakness, but because she refused to let the shape of his world unsettle her before he had addressed the wound that actually mattered. She betrayed you, Nina said quietly, and you still looked at me. Victor took that sentence like a blade. Yes. Silence followed. It lengthened. He did not defend himself. That, more than any explanation, made the room feel honest. Finally, he said, I was wrong. Nina looked back at him. There was no softness in her face now. No invitation to make this easier for him. You were cruel, she said. Victor's jaw tightened once. Yes, you made me stand in that room while strangers listened to you weigh my worth against your fear. His voice lowered. I know. No. Nina said, rising now. Anger finally finding its full shape. You know the facts. That isn't the same thing. Victor remained where he was, hands loose at his sides, absorbing every word without interruption. So Nina gave him all of it. You told me the truth in the library because you said I deserved the choice. You said you wouldn't let me stay blind. And the first moment your world started collapsing around you, you dragged me into that room and made me answer for sins that belonged to someone else. Her throat tightened, but her voice did not break. Do you understand what that feels like? To stay when any sensible woman would leave, only to be measured like an enemy the second it becomes inconvenient to trust you? Victor's face changed then, not outwardly enough for a stranger to see, but enough. The cold precision cracked at the edges. What remained looked less like power than regret. Yes, he said quietly. I understand that I used my fear like evidence. The sentence landed with brutal accuracy. Nina said nothing. Victor stepped closer, but not too close. He had learned at least that much overnight. When my father died, he said, the betrayal didn't end with the crash. It spread afterward. Men who ate at our table sold names. Men who swore loyalty moved money out of accounts they had no right to touch. Every kindness became suspect. Every silence became a calculation. He swallowed once, hard enough that she noticed. I built my life after that around one principle. Doubt first, regret later. Nina's expression did not soften. And how has that worked for you? A humorless breath left him. Poorly. That's one word for it. Victor nodded once, accepting even that. Then, after a pause, he said, Justice is not always fair. The words sat between them, heavy and dark. Nina frowned slightly. In my world, he continued, justice is often ugly. Incomplete. Sometimes blood answers for blood, and still leaves the dead where they fell. But what I did to you last night wasn't justice. It was fear wearing the shape of authority. His eyes held hers with painful steadiness. And that is not a thing I have the right to ask you to forgive quickly. The room had gone very still, not because the danger had passed, because he had finally named it correctly. Nina folded her arms, less to protect herself than to keep from reaching for something she had no business offering yet. You don't get points for honesty after the damage is done. No. And saying you were afraid does not excuse what happened. No. She let the silence press. Victor stood under it without moving, and for the first time since she had met him, he seemed like a man with no shield left except truth. At last, Nina asked, Why did you come yourself? He looked at her as if the answer should have been obvious, because sending anyone else would have been another insult. That, at least, was true. And Daniel? She asked. Does he know? He knows enough. Nina glanced toward the window, where weak sunlight had finally begun to break through the cloud cover, leaving thin stripes of brightness across the rug. A strange thought crossed her then. Grief did not only hollow people out. Sometimes it trained them so thoroughly in loss that they began striking first, hurting what they loved before it had the chance to disappear. Victor had become that kind of man. And worse, he knew it. "What happens to Isabella?" Nina asked. Something hard returned to his face, not for her, but for the name. "She leaves the country today." "And Warren?" Victor's gaze sharpened. "Warren is learning that pressure cuts both ways." The answer carried a quiet violence that did not need detail. Nina looked back at him. "You still think this house can be protected by control alone? It can be protected by vigilance. That's not the same thing." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." Another silence opened. Less jagged now, still dangerous. Then Victor said, very carefully, "I told you before that boundaries would become harder to maintain if you stayed." Nina's pulse shifted, though her face remained unreadable. "Yes, I was wrong about the shape of that problem." His voice lowered. "The real danger is that I have already begun to care what you think of me more than I care for my own comfort." Last night proved that in the worst possible way. That should have sounded like manipulation. It did not. It sounded like a man ashamed of the truth and unwilling to hide it anyway. Nina held his gaze. "What exactly are you asking for?" "Not absolution." The answer came immediately. "And not softness." He paused. "A chance to earn back what I damaged." She let that hang. Outside the room, a cart rolled faintly down the hall. Somewhere deeper in the house, a door closed. Life continuing. Staff moving. Silver polished. Lunch prepared. The ordinary machinery of the estate carried on, even as something essential stood unsettled here between two people, and the cost of one terrible night. Finally, Nina spoke. "You do not get to test me again. You won't be tested again. You do not get to pull rank when you are frightened and call it necessity." His answer was immediate. "No. And if there is danger, if there are names or threats or changes that affect Daniel or me, you tell me directly." Victor nodded once. "You have my word." That phrase would have meant little from another man. From him, it meant everything, and still not enough. Nina saw him understand that. At the door, he stopped. For a moment she thought he would leave it there. Instead, without turning fully back, he said, "For what it's worth, I have spent years believing that caution kept people alive." A pause, but there are some forms of caution that simply become cowardice over time. Then he looked at her again, and in his face, for one brief, unguarded moment, she saw it clearly: not the boss, not the strategist, not the man feared in boardrooms and back rooms alike, just a son who had inherited violence, a brother who had confused control for love, and a man who now understood, perhaps too late, that silent apologies were for the weak and true repentance had to stand in the light. Nina did not forgive him. Not yet, but she did not ask him to leave. Victor seemed to understand the difference. When he walked out, the room did not feel healed. It felt honest. And in a house where betrayal had once arrived wearing a familiar face, honesty was not a small thing. It was the beginning of a new kind of loyalty, the kind that did not come from fear, but from seeing the worst in someone and making them answer for it before deciding whether they were still worth standing beside. By the time Daniel returned from school that afternoon, he found Nina in the sunroom with the meal calendar open again, and sunlight finally warming the glass. He dropped his bag by the chair and looked at her carefully. "Well?" Nina did not look up immediately. "Your brother was wrong." Daniel waited. "And?" he asked. She met his eyes then. "And now he knows exactly how expensive that mistake was." Daniel absorbed that, then nodded once with a seriousness far beyond his years. "Good." Nina almost smiled, because in the Moretti house, forgiveness was never the first step. Truth was, by Friday evening, the house felt too still, not peaceful, waiting. Nina sensed it before anyone said a word. It was in the way the staff moved with more economy than usual, in the way Mrs. Harris checked the locks twice without announcing that she was doing it, in the way Victor took 2 phone calls near the study window and ended both with the same clipped silence instead of goodbye. Daniel felt it too. He sat in the sunroom after dinner with a geometry book open and his pencil unmoving, staring at the rain-dark lawn as if it might explain the pressure gathering around the house. "What is it tonight?" he asked at last. Nina looked up from the reading notes she had been organizing for him. "What do you mean?" He gave her a flat look. "Please, even I know this isn't normal." In most houses, she might have lied. Not here. Your brother is expecting something, she said carefully. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Something like a meeting? No. He studied her face. Something worse. Nina did not answer. That was enough. Daniel closed the geometry book. I hate this. She set down her pen. I know. No, you don't. His voice sharpened, but the anger in it was frightened rather than cruel. You know pieces. You know enough to stay calm. I live here. I know what it sounds like when the whole house starts pretending not to be afraid. The truth of that landed with painful force. Nina stood and crossed to the window. More to think than to look outside. The lawn lights reflected weakly in the wet glass. Beyond the gates, beyond the long private road, the rest of the world was still moving through ordinary Friday night routines, takeout dinners, ball games on television, tired parents loading dishwashers while children argued upstairs about homework. Inside the Moretti house, ordinary had become something far more fragile. She turned back toward Daniel. Then, listen to me carefully. He straightened. If Victor tells you to go upstairs tonight, you go. No argument. No trying to listen at doors. No proving you're not a child by stepping into something built for grown men to destroy each other. Daniel's jaw tightened. That speech sounds rehearsed. It sounds necessary. He looked away first. The silence between them held for a moment before footsteps approached in the hallway. Neither of them needed to guess who it was. Victor stopped at the doorway. He was dressed for evening, but not for dinner. Dark suit. No tie. Shoulders set in that unnervingly calm posture that meant he had already made decisions other people had not yet heard about. His gaze moved first to Daniel, then to Nina. There's a car coming at 9, he said. It will take Daniel to the guest house on the north property. Daniel stood immediately. No. Victor did not raise his voice. Yes. I'm not leaving the house because you've decided to brood dramatically. This is not a negotiation. Daniel took a step forward. Then, say what it is. Victor's face changed by almost nothing. But Nina saw it, the cold tightening at the edges. It is precaution. Against who? Victor gave him a hard look. Against men who confuse pressure with strategy. Daniel let out a bitter breath. That means Warren. Victor did not answer. That was answer enough. Nina looked from one brother to the other and saw the same wound wearing different faces. Daniel fighting to be included because exclusion felt too much like helplessness. Victor shutting doors because helplessness had already cost him too much once. Daniel, Nina said quietly. He looked at her. You need to go. His expression shifted. Hurt first. Then resignation. You too? Yes. He looked back at Victor. And what about her? Victor answered before Nina could. She stays. Daniel frowned. That makes no sense. It doesn't need to make sense to you. It does if she's part of this house now. The words hung there, larger than Daniel probably intended. Victor's gaze flicked briefly toward Nina, then back to his brother. She stays because I said so. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. That's not a reason. That's just your favorite sentence. Under any other circumstances, Nina might have admired the courage of it. Tonight, she only heard the fear underneath. Victor crossed the room and stopped directly in front of Daniel. Not threatening. Final. You're leaving because I can protect this house better if I am not wondering whether my brother is standing in the middle of it. Daniel's face changed then. The anger didn't vanish. But beneath it, something younger and more vulnerable surfaced. He looked suddenly like the boy in the photograph again, the one with the loud laughing father and the missing tooth and no understanding yet of what kind of men the world could produce. Fine, he muttered. Victor nodded once. Good. Daniel grabbed his backpack from the chair and headed toward the door. When he reached Nina, he paused. Try not to get killed, he said, aiming for sarcasm and missing by a mile. Nina touched his shoulder lightly. Go. He left. Victor remained where he was for a second, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. Nina knew then that this was the hardest part for him, not the coming confrontation, not the men waiting beyond the gates, but the act of sending the last person he still knew how to protect in uncomplicated ways out of his reach. Is it really that bad? She asked. Victor turned toward her. Yes. The directness of the answer chilled the room. Nina folded her arms. Then I should leave too. No. Victor. His voice dropped. No, the refusal came so quickly, so absolutely, that it made her heartbeat change. He saw it. Of course he did. That car is for Daniel, he said. Not you. And what exactly am I supposed to do if the house becomes unsafe? Victor took a step closer. You stay in the West Wing. You lock the door if I tell you to. And you do not come looking for me unless I send for you. That sounds very close to an order I'm not planning to obey. Something dark and fleeting crossed his face. Not irritation, recognition. You always choose the worst moment to be difficult. Nina lifted her chin. I learned from the best. For one absurd second, in the middle of gathering danger, his mouth nearly curved. Then the expression was gone. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small black phone. Not a cell phone. Simpler. Secure. If anything changes, he said, placing it in her hand. This rings. You answer. No one else. Nina looked down at the device, then back at him. Victor, he interrupted her softly. I mean it. There was something in his face then she had not seen before with such naked clarity. Not command. Fear. Not fear for himself. For her, the realization struck more deeply than it should have. Before she could answer, one of the men from security appeared in the doorway. Broad shoulders, rain on his coat, face set. They're here. Victor nodded once. The man stepped back. Silence followed, the last quiet before impact. Victor looked at Nina as though memorizing something he had no business needing to memorize. Go to the West Wing. She did not move. And if this goes wrong? His gaze held hers. Steady, terrible. Then I'll make sure it doesn't reach you. That should not have sounded intimate. It did. He turned and left before she could answer. From the second-floor landing, Nina watched the house transform. Cars rolled past the front drive in a slow procession, headlights cutting pale bands through the wet dark. Men entered through the side hall and the front vestibule, some familiar to the staff, some not. Their voices remained low, but the atmosphere changed with every new arrival. Security repositioned itself with practiced subtlety. Doors that usually stood open were now closed. The East Wing swallowed men like a throat. At 9:15, the first hard sound came. Not a shot. A chair, maybe. Or a fist meeting a table. Then a voice, sharp enough to carry even through thick walls. Nina stood in the upstairs sitting room with the secure phone in one hand, and every instinct in her body pushing against the command to stay put. Mrs. Harris entered without knocking. Daniel is on the north property, she said. He arrived safely. Nina exhaled for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. And Victor? Mrs. Harris's expression remained unreadable. Still standing. Another crash sounded from below. This time closer. Nina turned toward the door. Mrs. Harris's voice stopped her. If you go down there now, you won't be helping him. Nina faced her. Then tell me what will. The older woman looked at her for one long second, measuring the question against the woman asking it. Finally, she said, trust that when men like Warren come for power, they mistake noise for strength. Victor does not. As if summoned by the name, a shout rose from the lower hall. Then another voice cut through it. Victor's. Not loud. Worse than loud. Controlled enough to silence the rest. Nina could not make out every word. Only fragments. My father's name. My brother. My house. Then, distinctly, power built on fear always collapses. Eventually, the house went still afterward, as if every person inside it understood that the sentence had not been a warning. It had been a verdict. Another minute passed. Then two. No more shouting. No more crashing. Just footsteps moving quickly below, followed by a door opening. Closing. Another opening. The low murmur of security repositioning itself after the center of danger had shifted. Nina looked at Mrs. Harris. It's over. Perhaps, the older woman said. The secure phone rang. The sound was so sudden and sharp that Nina nearly dropped it. She answered at once. Victor's voice came through, calm and rough at the same time. Come downstairs. Nina was already moving before the line went dead. She crossed the hall, descended the staircase, and followed the trail of silence toward the East Wing. Men stood aside when they saw her coming. No one tried to stop her. That unsettled her more than resistance would have. The study door was open. Warren stood inside between two security men, his coat gone. his face pale with the stunned fury of a man who had expected leverage and found none. A cut marked one side of his mouth. The desk lamp cast hard light over scattered documents, a shattered glass on the rug, and the wet shine of rainwater tracked in by too many shoes. Victor stood by the fireplace. One hand braced on the mantel, the other reddened across the knuckles again. His expression was carved from exhaustion and control. When he saw Nina, something in his face shifted just slightly, but enough for her to know he had been waiting for her to appear. Warren followed his gaze and gave a bitter laugh. "So, this is the witness?" Victor did not even look at him. "Take him out." The security men moved immediately. Warren dug his heels in for half a second, rage overcoming sense. "You think this ends tonight?" Victor's voice remained flat. "Tonight is exactly when it ends." They took Warren from the room. The silence he left behind felt enormous. Nina stepped inside more slowly now, taking in the disorder. The open files, the toppled chair, the line of blood at Victor's hand where one knuckle had reopened. "What happened?" she asked. Victor looked at the closed door. He came to measure weakness, and his gaze returned to hers. He found none. The answer should have been reassuring. Instead, Nina heard the cost in it. She moved closer. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing important." That is usually how men describe wounds they haven't earned the right to ignore. A tired, almost disbelieving breath left him. Not laughter. Something near it. Then, before she could think better of it, Nina took the clean hand towel from the corner of the desk and stepped within reach. Victor did not stop her. She wrapped the towel around his bruised knuckles and felt him go very still. For one suspended moment, the whole violent machinery of the house seemed to fall away, leaving only this: a woman binding the hand of a man who had just defended everything he loved in the only language his world respected. Nina tied the cloth firmly and looked up. Victor was already looking at her. Not like a boss. Not like a strategist. Not even like a dangerous man. Like someone standing at the edge of exhaustion, held upright by fury, loyalty, and one fragile, impossible hope that he might not have to stand there alone forever. Outside, somewhere beyond the rain-dark windows, the gates remained closed, and the night kept moving. Inside, the war had come to the house and been turned back. But Nina understood as she stood in the wreckage of the study that victory was never clean in places like this. It left broken glass, blood on the carpet, frightened staff pretending not to tremble, and men like Victor Moretti forced to become the wall between family and ruin. And walls, no matter how strong, always paid a price for standing. By morning, the house looked almost ordinary again. That was the strange cruelty of places built on discipline and wealth. They knew how to hide the evidence of disaster by breakfast. Broken glass had been cleared. The rug from the study was gone. Fresh flowers stood in the front hall as if nothing violent had entered the night before. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. Silver warmed under polished light. Staff moved quietly, efficiently, speaking in the soft tones of people who had survived another storm by pretending it had only been weather. But Nina knew better. She saw it in the slight stiffness of the security men posted near the side entrance, in the way Mrs. Harris inspected the east wing herself before allowing the morning routine to resume, in the way Victor did not come down for breakfast until nearly 9, later than usual, his face composed and his hand bandaged beneath the cuff of his shirt. Daniel arrived back from the guest house shortly after 8:30. Carrying an overnight bag and 1,000 questions he had clearly been asking the driver with no success. The moment he stepped into the kitchen, his eyes went straight to Victor. "Is it over?" Victor, standing near the coffee service in shirt sleeves and dark slacks, looked at his brother with the kind of tired honesty that only appeared after something irreversible had already happened. "Yes." Daniel dropped the bag by the door. "Completely?" Victor held his gaze. "As completely as things like this ever are." It was not the comforting answer of an ordinary family. It was the true answer of this one. Daniel absorbed it in silence. Then his eyes shifted to the white bandage at Victor's hand. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." Nina, who was setting plates on the table, said without looking up, "That is not true." And it wasn't convincing the first time either. Daniel's mouth twitched despite the worry still lodged in his face. Victor glanced at her. It was a brief look, but it carried everything the room could not safely name: gratitude, fatigue, restraint, and the lingering aftershock of having found her in the study the night before, standing inside the wreckage instead of fleeing from it. Mrs. Harris entered then with a folded newspaper under one arm and her glasses balanced low on her nose. "The article is already up online," she said. Victor took the paper. Nina saw the headline before he turned it over. "Local businessman under investigation for financial fraud." No names larger than Warren's. No mention of the confrontation in the house. No mention of what power had actually shifted overnight. Just the clean public version of an ugly private war. Daniel frowned. "That's it?" Victor folded the paper once. "That's enough." Nina understood the lesson in that immediately. In Victor's world, justice did not always arrive wearing white gloves and public praise. Sometimes it came quietly, a sealed account, a frightened witness, an investigation timed to ruin a man before his allies could rescue him. Justice is not always fair, she thought, but sometimes it is still necessary. Breakfast settled into an uneasy peace after that. Daniel ate more than usual, perhaps because fear had exhausted him, perhaps because knowing something had ended gave hunger permission to return. Mrs. Harris supervised the kitchen with unusual calm. Victor remained at the table longer than he normally would have, answering 2 calls and declining a third. He did not leave until Daniel had finished eating. That, too, Nina noticed. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat in the sunroom pretending to work on a chemistry packet while glancing every 3 minutes toward the garden path where Victor and 2 men from security were speaking near the trimmed hedges. "He's different," Daniel said. Nina looked up from the stack of bills Mrs. Harris had asked her to organize. "Different how?" Daniel shrugged one shoulder. "Quieter. That may just mean tired." "No." He shook his head. "Tired for Victor usually means worse." He tapped the end of his pencil against the page. "This is something else." Nina followed his gaze through the window. Victor stood with his weight evenly set, shoulders straight, one hand in his coat pocket, the bandaged one hidden but still present in the shape of his posture. Even from a distance, she could tell he was making decisions. Final ones. The sort that would move money, shift loyalty, close doors that had once been left open out of tradition or convenience. "What do you think it is?" she asked. Daniel looked at her as if the answer should have been obvious. "You." The word was so immediate that Nina almost laughed. "Instead," she said, "that is a dramatic conclusion. It's an accurate one." He leaned back in his chair. "Before you came here, his entire personality was, 'I'll handle it.' Then you show up, start making me act like a human being again, and suddenly he's telling the truth more than usual and looking guilty when he deserves to." Nina lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her. "You're 16. You should not be this perceptive. It's a terrible burden." That finally drew the edge of a smile from her. But Daniel was not finished. "He likes control because he thinks control is the same thing as safety," he said, more quietly now. "You're the first person who's made him look at the difference." Nina did not answer immediately, because the boy was right. Victor had built himself into a wall hard, useful, nearly impossible to move. But walls were not homes. They were only what kept ruin out until someone inside remembered how to live again. By early evening, the house had softened. Not fully. Perhaps it never would, but the sharp alertness of the previous night had loosened into something closer to breath. Staff crossed halls without looking over their shoulders. Mrs. Harris instructed the cook to make pot roast instead of something delicate and formal. The kind of practical comfort meal that belonged to older America: slow-cooked beef, roasted carrots, mashed potatoes, warm bread, food that said the family had survived and now needed feeding. At dinner, Victor surprised all of them by arriving on time. Daniel noticed first. "Should I be worried?" Victor sat at the head of the table and reached for his water glass. "About what?" "You being here before the food gets cold." A pause. Then, to Nina's quiet astonishment, Victor replied, "Perhaps I'm developing better habits." Daniel looked at him suspiciously. "That sounds fake." "It's called effort," Nina said. Victor's gaze moved to her then, steady and unreadable for half a beat too long. "Is that what this is?" he asked. Her pulse changed in spite of herself. "It could be," Mrs. Harris, passing between them with the bread basket, said dryly. "How comforting to see civilization finally reaching this table." Daniel choked on a laugh. The moment was small, But in this house, small things mattered. A meal without dread, a joke that landed, the sound of silver against plates instead of voices raised behind closed doors. After dinner, Daniel took his dessert upstairs with the chemistry packet he still wasn't going to finish, leaving Nina and Victor alone in the dining room while the staff cleared quietly around them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victor rose, circled the table, and stopped beside the long window overlooking the rear lawn. Beyond the glass, dusk had settled blue over the estate. The garden lights had just begun to glow. Nina. She stood too, though more slowly. Yes, he did not turn at once. When he finally did, his face was calm, but the decision in it was unmistakable. I've spent the better part of 10 years trying to preserve what my father built while cutting away everything that poisoned it. His voice was low, carrying no farther than her. I told myself I was protecting my brother, protecting the family name, protecting what remained. Nina crossed the room until only a few feet separated them. And, were you? Sometimes, a faint, humorless breath left him. Other times I was only preserving the machine because I didn't know who I was without it. The honesty of that settled between them like a door opening. Victor looked down at his bandaged hand, then back at her. Last night made one thing very clear. Warren came at this house because he still believed fear could govern men forever. He was wrong. His eyes held hers, and if I keep building this family around the same principle, eventually I'll be wrong too. Nina listened without interrupting. I'm restructuring everything, he said. Closing the shipping channels my father should have shut years ago. Moving the legal holdings under separate management. Cutting ties with men who only understand profit through intimidation. He paused. It won't be quick, and it won't be clean, but it will be done. Nina searched his face. Because of Warren? Because of Daniel. A beat. Then, more quietly, because of you. There it was. Not a grand declaration. Not romance shaped like fantasy. Something older, harder, more costly. The kind of truth grown people spoke when they understood exactly what change demanded. Nina exhaled slowly. Victor, he stepped closer, but carefully, giving her every inch of choice he had once almost taken from her. I'm not asking you to save me, he said, and I'm not making promises like a boy who has never had to bury anyone. His voice softened, though it never lost its weight. I'm telling you that if there is going to be a future worth keeping in this house, it cannot be built on blood and fear alone. Nina looked at him for a long time, at the fatigue in his face, at the bandaged hand, at the terrible discipline of a man who had spent years carrying power like a wound, and still, somehow, had not become empty under the weight of it. Then she said the only thing that mattered. No more secrets. Victor answered immediately. No more secrets. No more using protection as an excuse for silence. No. And no more blood where another way is possible. Something moved in his expression, then something like grief meeting hope and not knowing yet whether to trust it. I can promise the attempt, he said. And I can promise that for the first time in a very long time, the attempt will be honest. It was not perfection. It was better. It was truth. Nina stepped the final distance between them. Not into his arms. Not yet. But close enough that the air changed. Then that's where it begins, she said. Victor's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, then returned to her eyes. Even now, even here, restraint stayed with him. She respected him more for that than she would have for any dramatic gesture. From upstairs came the faint sound of Daniel arguing with his chemistry homework, followed by a drawer slamming and a muttered curse. The ordinary domestic sound broke the intensity just enough for Nina to smile. Victor heard it and glanced toward the ceiling. He'll need help with stoichiometry. He'll need help with patience. He never had that. No, Nina said softly. But he has us. Victor looked at her again, and this time there was nothing guarded left in his face. Not because he had become harmless, because he had finally chosen what he wanted his strength to serve. Outside, the first clean stars were beginning to show above the dark line of trees beyond the estate walls. Inside, the dining room had emptied. The candles burned lower. The silver had been cleared away. Somewhere in the kitchen, the cook was wrapping leftovers while Mrs. Harris likely checked the locks one last time out of habit. Not fear. The house was still imperfect, still marked, still carrying the weight of what had been done inside it. But for the first time since Nina arrived, it no longer felt ruled by ghosts. It felt lived in. It felt chosen. The next morning, breakfast held the shape of something new. Daniel came down in socks and a wrinkled school shirt, complaining about chemistry. Mrs. Harris corrected his tie. Victor was already seated with coffee and the financial pages open beside him, bandaged hand resting on the table as if he no longer felt the need to hide it. Nina set a basket of toast between them, and when Daniel asked if this meant the world had finally stopped ending, Victor answered, "Not the world. Just this week." Daniel grinned. Mrs. Harris shook her head, and Nina, standing there in the warm light of an ordinary morning, understood the truth of what had survived. Not the money, not the gates, not the reputation. A family, damaged, unfinished, hard-won, but real. Justice, she thought, was not always fair. It did not return fathers to tables or erase the years fear had stolen, but sometimes justice looked like this instead. A house still standing, a boy still laughing, a man finally choosing to become more than the violence that made him, and a future beginning not with innocence, but with honesty. That was enough, more than enough. It was home. This story reminds us that love alone is not enough unless it is built on truth, trust, and the courage to change. Silent justice may not look clean or gentle, but real strength is not found in fear, control, or power. It is found in loyalty, honesty, and the choice to become better for the people we love. In the end, the story teaches that even wounded people can build a real home, not by hiding their darkness, but by facing it with dignity, responsibility, and heart. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.